So 40k Space Dwarves are looking very strong indeed, but let's take a look at some of the areas where they're decidedly lacking. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Votann once more. As I'm sure most of you are aware, the codex has leaked out onto the internet, and people are starting to get a bit of a feel for how the leagues are going to be shaping up. In general, the initial reaction to the codex does seem that it's very powerful indeed. A lot of people are concerned that it might be one of the single strongest armies in 40k, and perhaps put us back into a state where game balance is just out of whack again, and determined once more by whichever codex Games Workshop released last. I'm certainly not denying that a lot of the codex seems strong, but I feel like perhaps people might be underestimating some of the weaknesses of the book, which I thought would be interesting to go through in this video. Before just talking about weaknesses though, I think it's certainly important to acknowledge their main strengths. Perhaps just the clear and most obvious thing is that with those judgment tokens, Leagues of Votann have access to some pretty crazy damage. A lot of their units have kind of okay shooting profiles to start with, but it's all of those profiles plus judgment tokens and a few other key buffs that just looks like the Leagues of Votann, if they can bring their might to bear, will be able to stack incredible amounts of power on enemy units that are in range of them. I think judgment tokens as a thing are maybe surprisingly easy to hand out. You get them when enemies kill your units opportunistically. You can throw one out with a car, you get one for free for actions or enemies holding objectives, so they are going to be able to hand them out fairly well. It's perhaps extra bad news for tough units. I feel like Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights might have some trouble against the Votann, when the main defense is being big and having massive toughness. Getting auto wounds on a 4+ is really bad news. Votann look like they're going to be exceptionally good at taking down super heavies. Otherwise though, besides that, I think the codex has a lot of other powerful features. A railgun on the land fortress that can delete big chunks of tanks or squads almost guarantees. The fact that it's mounted on a very tough platform with other good guns is just adding insult to injury there. They have OBSEC bikers that can move 24 inches for 1 CP, which is pretty nutty in itself, though I would say that there are some limitations with that. Void armor is an absolutely awesome army-wide special rule. Basically armor of contempt with turn-off wound and damage rerolls. It does counter quite a lot of things. Finally, I do think within the codex the HQ units seem to be very good value in terms of buffs for the points. I'd expect to see at least 3 characters in most Leagues of Votann lists. Overall, I think no one's denying that they've got lots of awesome strength. Ridiculous amounts of raw damage is never going to hurt you in 40k, though I do wonder a little bit just how easy it might be to bring to bear. First up, and I think maybe something that at least a few people underestimate, is that a lot of the Votann army is just very slow. They do have some quicker options, but I feel like despite those options, they're probably still going to be in contention for one of the slowest moving armies in 40k, perhaps alongside armies like Death Guard. Compared with Death Guard as a faction, I might feel that they're just a little bit less on the durability side, but much more on the high damage side, at least when talking about all their units taken as a whole. Their infantry do seem to be particularly hard hit on that way. They move 5 inches and they can only advance 3 inches. It is reliable movement, but it means that even in the best case scenarios, you're not usually going to be getting on to, say, midfield objectives. On the turns that they're out of range, they're not even necessarily going to be able to move quite as far as units in other codexes, who could potentially make an advance roll and then do a CP reroll if they didn't get far enough. Quite a lot of other codexes, in one way or another, have ways to deal damage even when they're advancing, say assault weapons for example, but that just doesn't really seem to be a thing in the codex. Unless there's some niche character picks I'm forgetting or something, I think that the only assault weapon in the entire book is the shotgun on the Hernkin Pioneers, so if you do want that precious extra 3 or 6 inches worth of advance, then you're basically going to give up all possibility of doing any damage whatsoever that turn, either by shooting or charging. Unlike, say, Admech, who can make their Ruststalkers advance and charge in their formation, or the Sisters of Battle, who can do the same with their Repentia, or the same for Chaos Terminators, there's basically no real good ways of getting their foot infantry to get very long charges. There isn't anything that lets them advance and charge, and in general there's very few charge buffs in the codex. I think there was one in the custom leagues, but they don't look like they'll ever be taken. In general, I might go as far as to say that there aren't really any units that are both very fast, very tough, and very dangerous. Things like hard-hitting jump infantry, like say Blood Angel Sanguinary Guard, Chaos Space Marine Possessed with their 9-inch move, or Imperial Knight Armigers. There are literally no fast melee units in the codex, and the quick units are the Hernkin and the Sagittor, both of which do move 12 inches and do have some okay firepower, but they just really aren't all that tough to return firepower, even with void armor. For 30 points, the Hernkin are 3 wounds at toughness 5 with a 4+ save, and for 110 or more, the Sagittor is 9 wounds with toughness 7 and a 3 up save, less than the toughness of a Rhino. They're both pretty hard hitting if they're combined with judgment tokens, but they are going to die fairly easily to return fire. I guess maybe you could argue that the land fortress might just about fits the bill. It does have a 10-inch movement, though with being quite such a big model, it looks like it's going to have issues with terrain. Plus, it might not want to be getting super close in the first place for fear of getting locked up and its firepower messed with. In general, a slow movement means that early objectives might be a bit of a struggle or need big investment for more pricey units like Hernkin, and I think they'll have trouble catching enemy units, either being outranged by them some of the time or struggling to get line of sight on things hiding in ruins that they need to get round. In terms of their best mobility options, I think things like Sagittars with Hearthkin or Berserks look interesting. Hernkin are a solid scout move unit and can go very fast and have OBSEC, which is great, but they are a little bit expensive. Or I guess perhaps teleporting Iron here could be rather scary. Even if they don't move fast, at least you can pay for that stratagem to jump them across the board. Sort of going hand in hand and doubling down on the slow movement are that most of their weapon ranges tend to be rather on the short side. Pretty well the entire codex has a 36-inch range cap or less, and most of the guns tend to be 18 inches to 24 inches. It's certainly not unworkable with cramped battlefields on 9th edition, but it's also not amazing. You're not going to be able to have units that just shoot things across the other side of the battlefield, and it certainly could limit which units you can target. Particularly for things like infantry, it means that if you combine a 5 inches and say a 24-inch range, you might have the opportunity just to deliberately put your unit just over 29 inches away, and then you can 100% guarantee that you're not going to get shot by that unit next turn. That could be even easier with 18-inch range weapons, and potentially even the longer range stuff, depending on what line of sight is available. The longest range guns on the army are things like the bolt cannons on the Sagittars and the Land Fortress, plus the scary railgun is 36 inches as well. It does seem that in Votann armies those things are almost guaranteed to tear big chunks out of your force, and are definitely an army strength for them. As a faction, they also have very little to no ignores line of sight, a few one-shot missiles on land fortresses if you take the upgrade, plus a mole launcher from the Berserks. They're not going to have the option for turn-on-turn damage chipping away at injured units with artillery. Generally, I feel that this combined with their short movement means that things that are very fast and can jump from cover to cover and get the first strike on them are generally going to have a good time. If they can't get range or line of sight on you, then all their massive damage output might not necessarily mean much. In terms of damage profiles to kill Votann units, if they do start to become a big part of the meta that people tailor to, I think there are some things that people might be able to do to damage them better. I feel that they're a faction that's actually going to be deceptively easily killed with mortal wounds. Even compared with things like Space Marines, a lot of their units just don't really have all that many wounds for the points, even if they might have sturdy protection with things like high toughness or void armor. Typically, a lot of their squads usually work out at around about 12 points per wound, things like Hearthkin, Sagittars, Berserks, or Hernkin, and it only gets worse on even more elite things like the Iron Here Hearthguard or the Land Fortress. It seems they have very little access to general mortal wound protection besides one of their sub-faction locked stratagems, and I feel that's a bit of a weakness with so many armies dealing mass mortal wounds in 40k. Scary Thousand Suns and Tyrannid Psychic phases should be able to tear some chunks out of them. I think often they are going to want to run a Grimnir, so that will give you at least one Psychic Deny, but in general they don't really strike me as a faction that's got all that much Psychic defense. Otherwise, besides mortal wounds, it looks like AP0 is actually going to be surprisingly good against a lot of these things. A lot of the infantry and bikes have a 4+. Damage 2 weapons are often a bit of a liability in 40k, but they look like they'll be at home targeting things in the leagues of Votann. It's only their exo armor that has a -1 damage, so it should be pretty handy chewing through their vehicles, and I think that Hearthkin warriors are still efficient enough to be worth shooting at with them. Otherwise, obviously, you'd want to avoid AP -1 because of void armor, but anything AP -2 or AP -3 should usually affect quite a lot of their units. Most of the time, you don't really need to be spamming Melter too much or anything like that. If Votann do become very popular as well, obviously there wouldn't be much value in reroll wounds against them, so things like Lieutenant options or Lightning Claws might just become a little bit less popular if they do become super strong. I think another genuine issue that they have is that they do seem to have a bit of a lack of expendable units. There isn't really a whole lot in the roster that I just want to throw straight onto exposed objectives, take a lot of firepower and not feel too bad about it. Pretty much all of their units cost more than 100 points. The Hearthkin are 110, as are the Berserks and the Sagittar. The Hernkin are only 90 base, but often they want to take that very cheap gun upgrade for 100 points. You'd be giving up really quite a spectacular amount of damage output if you pass that up. Interestingly, the way to get the smallest squads in the book are to use a pair of Sagittars and have your Hearthkin units break down into 2 5-model squads. At least that way you wouldn't be investing quite so much on a unit to stomp onto an objective or hold a backfield one. And getting small units could genuinely be an interesting advantage of using those transports. On top of that, for units that you want to hold objectives, I'd argue that most of them only have so-so toughness as well. The fast things aren't that tough. The Berserks are relatively fragile, even with their Feel No Pain, and even their pseudo-Terminators with Exo Armor perhaps don't look like they're quite as tough as standard Space Marine or Chaos Marine Terminators, and certainly not with the buffs that Space Marines and Chaos Marines can give them. Only 2 wounds is quite painful, even if they do have the -1 damage. Again, I guess one of the exceptions might well be the Land Fortress. Again, very, very tough. Perhaps could be a good one to park on home field objectives and move up towards safe midfield ones when it doesn't matter as much about your firepower getting locked up and forced to target not what you want. In general, though, it does seem that when exposing a unit, Votann players will be sacrificing a fair bit if the enemy can get some decent guns to bear. They're probably going to struggle to jump from cover to cover as well, so they're usually going to expose bits to shooting or counter-attacks as they go. I feel like probably only the bikes with their fast movement and fly are going to be good enough for that, and even they might be a little bit hard to hide with those big bases. Finally, and particularly in Nephilim, the objectives and their faction-specific secondaries do seem to be a bit more important than ever, and I feel like while they're probably not going to be a terrible faction on primaries and secondaries, I certainly don't think that they're going to be one of the strongest either, maybe having more trouble on secondaries than some. From primaries, as I just mentioned, a bunch of their units don't have super high toughness, and if they're forced to expose themselves to get on an objective or something, they're likely to lose some valuable models. A lot of their infantry aren't going to be getting to objectives in any reasonable time whatsoever. Most things, even with advancing, won't be able to jump on midfield objectives turn 1. And while the Honekin Pioneers can help out with that, you're also paying at least a fair amount of investment for them, at usually 100 points per unit with the big gun. Even when they get to midfield things, I feel like Hearthkin Warriors perhaps aren't really wanting to be in maximum danger range themselves. They do have void armor, but they're still only 1 wound 4+ save infantry, and bolters and small arms are going to whittle down their numbers. If the fast units do get dealt with, it could give them problems, though I suppose if any accelerated things do survive into the late game, you could think about using that accelerated stratagem for the 12-inch advance. That's 1 CP for some crazy movement. Or perhaps that teleport stratagem, 2 CP for a Hearthguard unit, 1 CP for a character. Both of those I think look like they could be on paper quite good for grabbing objectives if those units survive. While I'd say they're generally okay, but maybe not stand out on primaries, I feel like for the most part their secondary objectives just aren't really all that strong, or at least not the in-faction ones. It looks like the best of the bunch might be their Judgment Token one, get 2 VP for killing a unit with a Judgment Token in a phase, and 3 VP if it happened to have 3 of them. That one does allow you to rack up the points really quite quickly. Against some relatively multiple small unit type opponents, that shouldn't be too hard to max over the course of the game. But then at the end of the game, you do have a bit of a reckoning. Anything that had a Judgment Token but didn't die will get you -1 victory points. And often I feel like the units that do survive might well have killed a Votann unit, so you might be looking at maybe another 3 victory points lost if the enemy's still got survivors. I think it's still probably going to be their most taken secondary, but even then it doesn't look like you're going to automatically max it or anything. Otherwise, the others just don't really seem very tempting to me. Grudge Match has you nominate 5 different enemy units, and then you need to ideally kill them in melee and for them to be big units to max it. It seems pretty bad unless you're going all melee, and even then your opponent only has to keep 1 unit safe for it to be a fairly mediocre score. Otherwise, Lay Claim has your opponent set up multiple different objective markers for you to take at the end of the game. Basically seems like a win big if you table your opponent, lose hard if you don't, which is rarely a good thing with a secondary, but I guess with massive Votann firepower it might still be achievable. Finally, there's Prospect of Wealth, which seems okay but less good than Banners. The opponent can counter it by repeatedly putting units on midfield objectives, so I feel like Banners might just be the better bet. I guess having one that you can build hard for is okay, though I don't feel they're anywhere near in the same position as armies like Sisters or Admech with multiple great ones to pick from. So anyway, that just about brings us to the end of 5 weaknesses for the Leagues of Votann, and I would be interested to hear your guys' opinions on the faction. From the rules that we've seen so far, do they look like they're going to be a super strong faction that's just going to annihilate the competition, or are these weaknesses going to make them struggle with certain factions? I do feel like very fast moving, perhaps assault type armies might give them some real trouble. Maybe armies like Eldar Harlequins might have a lot of foils to some of the Votann's nastiest tricks. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly be aiming to make a fair bit more content about the Leagues of Votann, It'll be fun to take a look at their units in a bit more detail. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and if you're interested then you can find that down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.